Hi everyone, this is Ms. Cahill, and this video is going to review the timed rate for the yellow wallpaper. In this video, I will break down the prompt. I'll summarize some key points in the story itself, talk about some themes you may want to touch upon, and some key ideas that you really should have been able to pull from the story. So let's start with the prompt itself. The prompt reads, in Charlotte Perkins Gilman's short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, the narrator's circumstances cause her to undergo significant changes as a character. Read the story carefully, then in a well-written, organized essay, doesn't say organized, I added that, analyze how Gilman uses literary techniques such as characterization, point of view, and setting to reveal the complexity of the narrator's situation. So, first thing you want to know is that the prompt is giving you a clue that the narrator's change is important. Pay attention to those clues when they exist. Then the prompt suggests some techniques that you can use, characterization, point of view, and setting, but it doesn't demand that you use those. So if you want to talk about something else, you always can do that. These are present in the story, so there's something that you may want to consider. But again, if you want to unpack dialogue or diction or something else in the story that stood out to you, it's totally fine. In order to answer this prompt completely, you have to indicate why the narrator's situation is complex. And so I'd like you to think about what factors contribute to the conflicts that she faces, particularly her central conflict with her mental health. You want to unpack layers in order to address that complexity. And then finally, as you know at this point, in order to earn a high score on this prompt, you must address theme, even though the prompt does not directly ask for the meaning of the work as a whole. So I would hope that at this point in the year, themes are starting to come naturally to you and that you'll find a way to work that into your essays. So let's take a look at just the story in general here. So this story revolves around a narrator who suffers clearly from mental health issues. She's got a husband, a brother, and a sister-in-law that refuse to acknowledge that she has legitimate mental issues, right? They just belittle her the entire time. Her husband, in particular, he continues to use language that is belittling to her, making her feel like she doesn't have a right to complain or she doesn't know what she's talking about. Okay, and confines her to this room with the yellow wallpaper instead of letting her go out and socialize with the rest of the world. She references past struggles, so that leads us to believe that her mental health issues are not new. She talks about as a child sitting awake and being able to get more entertainment from nothing, blankness on walls, than most people can find in a toy store. So it's clear that she has very imaginative tendencies, but we're not sure whether or not those tendencies are good or bad at that point in the story. The narrator also indicates that she's just had a child. So knowing that postpartum depression is a thing, we may want to consider whether or not that's factoring into the severity of what she's going through right now. She talks about having her dear baby, but cannot be with him because it makes her nervous. So we get the sense that she feels she's a danger to herself right now. Throughout the story, the narrator develops this intimate relationship with the setting around her, particularly the wallpaper, and she has a little bit of a relationship with the bed and the other objects in the room. She creates characters out of the figures on the wall because she has no one to interact with. And she says that she understands something about the figures in the wall that no one else possibly could, and even identifies there's a woman behind the wall creeping, trying to get out. She starts to identify with that woman as the story progresses and really makes it her responsibility to get this woman out from behind that wallpaper. And by the end of the story, she becomes the woman in her mind that is trapped behind the wallpaper. So there's a severe descent into delusion at that point. And then by the end of the story, the narrator, who couldn't wait to get out of this room, can't wait to stay in there. She doesn't want to leave. She says it's pleasant. She likes creeping around like the woman in the wallpaper, and she just won't even go outside if someone asks her to. So we see the narrator start from being mostly rational and clearly just going through a few things, as she's left in isolation, she moves deeper and deeper into madness and lets her mind create a reality that isn't really there. And that reality takes over. Okay. Now, some themes you may want to consider here are obviously mental health, and I'll also talk a little bit about gender roles. So, thinking about mental health, it's obvious that she has some mental health issues. She's never receiving the help that she needs, but she does ask for things throughout the story and tries to advocate for herself. She mentions to her husband that she would like to go out and socialize, or would like to take a trip, or would like to go visit her cousins. Even she would like to write, and her husband's like, no, you can't do that. That's not what's good for you. And so he forces her into this setting that feels very restricting to her. The isolation and the detachment from others really exacerbates the issues that were clearly already there and pushes her deeper and deeper into that imaginary world. Without having people to socialize with, she has to create a world that she can interact with. And so she begins to identify with the inanimate objects in the room and the characters that she creates in the wall. All of that is an indication of a delusional mindset. And so the use of a first-person narrator gives us that firsthand account of this descent into madness. The passing of time throughout the story, indicated by those little breaks, those like 5 dots or whatever that are in between sections, help us understand that as more time passes, she gets more and more detached from reality. Okay? And so you could relate all of this to mental health issues in general and how perhaps they are not taken seriously by many. Because if people maybe had taken her mental health issues seriously, things could have been different. Okay? We've also got some gender role complexity going on here. As would have been customary for the time, the husband is obviously in charge. Her husband and her brother are both physicians. They're both doctors. So she references that both of them think there's nothing wrong with her, and therefore there must be nothing wrong with her. And so they're almost gaslighting her into thinking that she's fine when she's really not. And that causes her to distrust herself as well. She refuses to believe at the beginning that they may be wrong. Initially, she thinks that her husband is saying things that are wise, but as the story progresses, she becomes more skeptical of his intentions. She talks about him earlier in the story as being like loving and caring toward her, but toward the end of the story, she talks about how let me see if I can find it. She says she's afraid of her husband, which is a new thing. And she also mentions that he pretends to be loving and kind. So she shifted from thinking that he actually is loving and kind to that he's putting on a show for her. And so the deeper she gets into this isolation, it's almost like the more aware she becomes of what her husband is doing to her, which is ironic because she's going crazy. It's like in her craziness, she has some insight. If you pay attention to John's dialogue throughout this, you'll also notice that he uses language that's very belittling. So you may want to unpack his characterization as an arrogant man because he uses words like blessed little goose or little girl to make her seem like less than him. And that's an important theme that you can unpack because, again, her husband is in control of what happens to her in this story. So what should we take away from this story? Well, the narrator is finding herself in a situation where she doesn't have any control. She can't do anything about this. And despite these constant attempts to advocate for herself, she has to stay in this room. She's almost like a prisoner who's been trapped in solitary confinement, which we now know is very bad for the mind. And so the longer she remains in isolation, the deeper she falls into her own madness. We could also argue that this situation was preventable, right? If those who had control over her life listened to what she was saying early on, it's possible that she wouldn't have fallen as deep into the situation as she does at the end. She is in a like hallucinatory trance at the end of this story and believes that she's a woman inside of the wallpaper and is creeping around on the ground, and she crawls over her husband who passes out. I mean, she has gone totally insane. And we wonder, if she had been taken seriously, would she have really gotten to that point? Because the narrator slowly loses her mind, it also makes it hard for the reader to trust what's happening. And so we could work in an unreliable narrator. And in this case, she's somewhat maybe unreliable at the beginning, as any first person narrator could be, because there's bias with any first person narrator. But she becomes increasingly unreliable as the story progresses, because she's going further and further into her own madness. So, if you want to unpack some of the complexity of her character, you may want to think about how it's hard to figure out what is true and what is just in her head. And that's part of what makes her a really complex character in general. Now, everything I've reviewed in this document is it's just options for this essay prompt. As with any one of these prompts, you could go in a lot of directions, but really the key thing here is that you need to understand why the narrator's situation is complex, and you need to demonstrate that by using literary techniques that are prevalent in the story. And of course, if you're going for that high score, you need to make sure that you connect it to one or more themes in the story. So I hope this story was I hope this video was helpful to you, to help you understand what possibly you could have written about this prompt and maybe understand the story a little bit better. Obviously, if you have any additional questions about this prompt, you can reach out to me via email or Google Classroom. I will make sure that I share these notes with you as well in case you want to look over them in more detail. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed reading what is one of my favorite stories, because as you know, Miss Cahill loves the crazies, right? I love a good story about a person descending into madness. It never ceases to be interesting, and I hope you found this as interesting as I did the first time that I read it. Thanks again.